Today on the podcast, I have my friend Dan Nash, who's joining us. He's the founder of the Human Trafficking Center and travels globally to teach police officers and communities and everybody about human trafficking and how to solve this epidemic, pandemic, endless problem that's growing.
For sure, probably all those three things.
All those three things, right? It's like second to drugs or guns?
Second to drugs, but it's catching drugs, and estimates are within 15 years it'll surpass drugs.
Oh my gosh, yes. You all know, if you've been following my journey, I'm a huge human advocate. I took a flag to the top of Mount Everest to say humans are not for sale. So when I ran across Dan, we've become friends over the last little bit. And he has such an exciting story because he was a police officer, an adventure athlete, and then ran with this card and is solving our world problems.
We're trying to, yeah. We're definitely trying to change the world.
Yeah. So tell me why you got into police in the first place.
Well, I graduated from college and I was going to be a lawyer, and I got accepted to law school, and I just, at the last minute, I just decided I don't think I want to be a lawyer. I just don't think that's for me. So then I was like, what do I want to do? And I wanted to be a quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs, but that job was already taken.
Okay.
So I couldn't do that. And then I wanted to be a mountain climber. I wanted to be a professional mountain climber. And back in those days, you really couldn't make a living climbing mountains. The guys that were, and girls that were trying to climb professional mountain areas, they were like living in vans and stuff. So I'm like, I got to get a real job. Mm-hmm. So I decided I wanted to go into law enforcement, and I tried to pick the best agency that I could pick, which in my agency was the state police. To be a state trooper, it paid better, it had better benefits and more opportunity. And but it was really competitive. Like 6,000 people applied for like 60 spots.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was super, super competitive. And I was fortunate enough to get hired and became a trooper, and yeah, did that for 27 years.
So why do you think it was so hard?
To get hired?
Yeah, like what kind of tests did they run you
So
through?
first thing they put you through is a physical fitness test.
Yep.
Second thing to put you through is a written exam.
Okay.
Right? And then the third thing they put you through is like a 2.5 month to 3 month background investigation, so they know everything about you.
Okay.
Right? And then you do a polygraph exam, and then you do a psychological exam, and then they put you through a medical exam, and they have all these different processes. It took about a year to get through all those processes and everything. And they whittled us down to 60 for the academy, and then the academy is paramilitary, so it's pretty hard in and of itself. And we graduated 49 out of 60.
Oh, wow. And did everybody stay in that area then?
No, so once you, at least because we're working for the state,
yep.
They sent people to all different parts of the state. So what started off with 6,000 people eventually whittled down to 49, and then they sent us all across the state.
Did you keep in touch with everybody throughout your career?
I did keep in touch with quite a few of them. It's funny, over the last, I retired 3 years ago, and about that time frame, we were all kind of retiring within a few months of each other and things like that. So we would all kind of stay in contact and maybe see each other before we retired, because some of us hadn't seen each other very many times over the years because we're stationed in different parts of the state and doing different jobs and things like that. So it was kind of nice to keep in touch with everybody.
Yeah. And what had your job evolved to over the 27 years?
Everybody starts off in patrol. So I started off in a patrol car like everybody else, answering calls, everything from domestic violence calls to, whatever. And then I became a detective.
Okay.
And I worked narcotics and vice. And so that's when I first started learning about prostitution and vice-related type crimes. And then I got promoted and ended up going into a major crimes unit, which investigated murders and things like that. And then eventually when we started doing human trafficking full-time, I'd been doing it kind of ad hoc during these other assignments.
Yep.
And then when we first started doing human trafficking, they offered the spot to me, and I was fortunate enough to be able to build the statewide human trafficking unit. And yeah, so I had a lot of years doing that. And then when I retired, I was like, I need to keep doing this. And here I am today.
Oh, I love it. And how did you fit adventure sports into that career?
It was actually much easier than what you think. So when I became a detective, we were working so many hours of overtime, right? Okay. So whether I was working homicides or whether I was working narcotics and vice-related crimes, we had, in some instances, thousands of hours of overtime at the end of the year. Well, in Missouri, our state has a balanced budget amendment, which means they just can't spend like $1 billion a year that they don't have, right?
Okay.
So they have to have a balanced budget. So they limited the amount of overtime that they would pay you. And then everything else went into a comp time bank, right? So there were times that I would end up with 500, 800, 900, 1,100 hours of overtime on the books. And they just wanted you to get it off. So I would just be like, hey, I need 6 weeks off to go climb Everest. And I would put in a request and boom, off I would go. And they didn't care. They just wanted the time off the books. So I would just month here, month there, and I was just climbing mountains all around the world.
Oh my gosh. Okay, what was your first mountain?
Well, I went to Colorado and climbed some like 14ers when I was like in high school and stuff.
Yep.
My first real mountain, I guess, so to speak, was probably Rainier.
Okay.
Went to Rainier when I was in college, and that was the first time I'd ever been on a glacier like that, and had crampons on and all that, and I was kind of hooked. And even though it's kind of just like a speed climb, it's like up and back in 2 days, but I was kind of hooked. And then I started going really to South America after that, Ecuador, Bolivia, and then I found Peru, and then I was really hooked.
Okay. Why Peru? Why did that
Man,
tip you
the
over?
climbing in Peru is just absolutely stunning. All the mountains you can climb there, and the way the snow, they create these cornices, and the way the snow hangs in the Andes like it doesn't do anywhere else in the world. It created these magnificent climbs, and you can just climb and climb and climb and climb and never run out of mountains. Plus, it's not busy there, and I'm kind of a free spirit kind of climber. I don't want to be standing in a line, like on Everest. I didn't really like that. I want to be out there like kind of on my own, doing my own thing. And Peru's like that. It's free. So I love Peru.
Oh, I have not been to Peru.
Oh, you should go.
Have you done El Mayo?
I have done Apalmayo, I've done Huascaran, I've done Pisco, I've done Chopacalqui, which is one of my favorite mountains ever to climb. That's a great one. It's got this huge mushroom cornice. Oh man, it's beautiful.
Uh-oh, more mountains might be in my future.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so then from South America, where did you go next?
To the Himalaya.
To the Himalaya, yeah.
And then once I got over there,
You're like,
I was
wow.
like, oh my gosh. Because I'm used to the Andes, which makes everything in the States look really small.
Right.
But then the Andes, I think they're the creme de la creme. And then I get to the Himalaya and I was like, okay, this is a completely different world now.
Yeah.
Completely different.
Yeah.
The first time you see Lhotse and Manaslu and Everest and all those peaks, you're just like, okay.
Yeah. Have you climbed all of them?
No, not all of them.
What ones have you climbed?
Of course, I've been on Everest, Manaslu, Shishapangma and Choyu on the Tibet side back when it was easier to go over there and do that. So yeah, I've done several.
Okay. Do you have any one that you want to go back to and be like, I want to get this one done?
Not really. I mean, I've been to Pakistan. I've done most of the mountains that I really wanted to do. Probably the only mountain that I would kind of go back and forth that I did not do that I thought about doing was K2. And of course, you did K2. But it's kind of risky.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of risky, and I always kind of went back and forth. Had a couple of opportunities to go, and I just never did do that. I always picked something else to do instead. But probably that's the only one that I think if I was going to go back and do it again, I probably would have tried to fit that in somewhere.
Okay. What one's your favorite that you climbed?
The favorite big mountain?
Yeah.
Probably Manaslu or Choyu.
Okay.
Choyu.
So that's your favorite 8,000er. How about anything over 14?
I think Chopacalqui in Peru.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
When you get to that mushroom, when you get up to that mushroom and you're walking that ridge, and then you see this massive mushroom, and you got to make this big 90-degree turn, and then you're going up on the side of this cornice, and you get up to the top. It's like, I don't know, 21,000 feet, but it's the most magnificent thing I think I've ever climbed, that big mushroom.
Oh, cool.
It's spectacular.
Would you do it again?
Oh yeah, I'd go to Chopacalqui again in a minute.
Okay, we're going. We're going to have a trip report for you guys someday in the future. So there you go. Okay, so what got you out of mountaineering?
Really, COVID, pandemic.
Yeah.
I was running my guide business at the time. We were doing really good. We were busy. We were doing basically all the continents. And COVID just basically shut everything down, right? We couldn't travel. You couldn't even get into a lot of countries. It was kind of over for a while. And at the time, I was doing human trafficking, working for the government. And I was kind of tinkering around with, should I retire, should I not? And so I finally decided to retire in 2021. And so many doors and so many windows had opened in the human trafficking world. And there was such a need for this that I was like, and it just blew up so quickly when I started my business that I was like, okay, I really kind of had a choice. I didn't really have time to do both. And I was also getting older. And to be quite honest, I still love the mountains. I just didn't like all the prep work anymore. The 100-mile bike rides all the time and all the working out, which I used to just love. But as you get older, you're like, do I really want to work out 3 hours today? Mm-hmm. Do I really want to go on a 7-hour bike ride today? At some point, after hundreds and thousands of miles on a bike, you're just like, I don't know that I want to do this. So I was like, I still want to be super athletic and I still work out, but I don't know that I want to work out to that level anymore. Mm-hmm. And my body was getting kind of broken in some areas, and so I was like, I think I need to move to this human trafficking thing. And a couple of things happened to me that were kind of like, I don't know if you're a spiritual person, it was kind of like a sign from God that I needed to just pursue this.
Okay. Well, what were those? You can't just hint to them. We'd like to know these like triggering moments that cause us to shift.
So when I started my business, it was myself and my friend Allison Phillips, who worked at the Attorney General's office, and we were both running the Human Trafficking Task Force together. And then I started working with a survivor. Her name is Megan. And she has kind of a rough story. I mean, she started being trafficked at 7 years old by her dad, and she was trafficked up into her early mid-20s, and she, finally got out, and she had contacts with law enforcement 16 times while she was being trafficked, and law enforcement never tried to help her because law enforcement didn't understand it. They didn't know what to do, right? She also had 10 contacts in the medical system with nurses and doctors in the medical world. They never tried to help her because they don't understand it either, right? So she had 26 times that no one ever helped her. And she finally gets out. She's teaching with us, and she calls me one day. And she says, and I knew she had some health issues, but I didn't know to what degree. And she calls me one day and says, hey, I need to tell you something. And I said, okay, what's going on? And she's like, I just went to this last doctor's appointment. And she'd seen all these experts at Mayo and all these different places. And they're like, I'm terminal, and they're telling me I have maybe like 12 to 18 months to live. And I'm kind of like, okay. And she says, I said, so what can I do to help you?
Yeah.
And she says, I just want to keep working with you guys. And she said, maybe this was just God's plan so that I could teach the police how to do this stuff so that other people don't have to go through what I went through. And she's 32 years old when she's telling me this. And I'm thinking, you're going to live to 33. Mm-hmm. She's never going to be married. She's never going to have kids. She's never going to have any of the stuff that all the rest of us got that probably do. Mm-hmm. She never went to homecoming. She never went to a prom. She's never had anything like that. And I'm looking at her, and she's not even mad.
Right.
I'd be pissed. I'd be pissed at the world. I'd be pissed at God. I'd be pissed at everybody. She never had a chance. It started for her when she was 7.
Right.
Right? And she's just like, I just want to help, and maybe this is just... So I was like, okay, I've got to do this. Looking at her, and we all have times in our life. I mean, you got 7 kids. Right. There's times in your life that your bandwidth is low, and whatever. And I'm like, none of us have anything to deal with her.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so I was like, I've got to do this. And so we started doing it, and it literally just started right off the bat. And within 3 weeks of retirement, I was teaching my first class, and it just went ever since. And I've been busy ever since.
Wow. Wow. Isn't that funny how people can come into our lives and those are the like laying in the sand moments? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think as people, we have the opportunity to make those moments too and not just wait for those to show up for us.
Sure.
I've been trying to be more conscientious of that in my days of, okay, the car accident was a line in the sand. I don't want another car accident to be a line in the sand.
Sure.
So what can I do to be proactive and build that line in the sand myself? So where do you see the human trafficking business going?
So right now, I mean, we are the premier human trafficking training business in the world. And, we're booked 7-8 months out most of the time. And we just want to keep doing this because, we have about 1 million police officers in the United States. And most people think that they're trained in human trafficking, but they're not. And only about 17% have any training whatsoever. And if you look at skills-based training, which is what law enforcement needs, it's only about 8%. Wow. So most of the police officers that you are going to encounter do not know what it is. They don't know what to do about it. They don't know how to investigate it. And what we see is once they are trained, it changes immediately. It's like, how do you expect a police officer to arrest a drunk driver if they don't know what a drunk driver looks like driving down the road, right? Mm-hmm. So I can tell you just this year, we taught around 6,500 police officers, and they've left our training and found 477 trafficking victims when they left. And the quickest was 4 hours and 15 minutes, and the youngest person was 11.
11.
So it happens just like this.
Wow.
But we got to train them.
Right. What a mission.
Yeah, so it's fun and it's rewarding when this morning I got a call from the East Coast this morning. I was telling you about it. They called me early this morning and they were telling me they were all excited because all the stuff that they had done, they found these trafficking victims, multiple trafficking victims, and arrested these people and had done all this. And it makes the police excited.
Right, it feels good.
Yeah, because they want to help their community. I mean, nobody becomes a police officer for the money and the accolades, right?
Right.
We do it because we want to make our community better, our city, our county, our state, our country. I mean, that's why they do it. So they get excited when they're able to find people that need help and help them.
Mm-hmm. It's so crazy to me. Let's talk about what human trafficking is, because I think a lot of people have a very narrow definition of what it is, and they're missing the bigger picture. Because before I understood more of it, I literally thought it was just sex exploitation. And it's so much more than that. It's not like somebody's being kidnapped and done this, that they're being coerced into it. Yeah,
so trafficking is not what we see on television or really even the news. I mean, it's we think of trafficking as, I'm going to walk out of the Target and somebody's going to kidnap my kid and traffic them. And that's not what happens in America. Traffickers are not kidnapping people in America and trafficking them. That's not what they're doing. They're finding someone that is vulnerable, and that can be a whole host of different things, right? Some of the biggest vulnerabilities we see are like kids that are runaways, kids that are in the foster care system, kids that have been physically or sexually abused as a child. Those are super big red flags that we'll see of kids that can be vulnerable, right? And then traffickers look for whatever that vulnerability is, and then they exploit it. So if your vulnerability is you've never really had love in your life, maybe you're from a really rough household, maybe your parents were never really involved in your life, or they were not there, or whatever, and you're looking for that parental type love, well, then that trafficker shows up, figures out what your vulnerability is, and then what do you think he provides? That. If your poverty is your vulnerability and you never really had any money, then they show up and provide that. And then they groom you and they manipulate you, right, to get you to do stuff for them. They test your boundaries, right, and push your boundaries. And then they convince you that, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing that. And the number one thing that we see in human trafficking and sex trafficking in America is prostitution. Most people, I think, are under the assumption that someone chooses to be a prostitute, and that's really just not the case. I mean, that is the people over the years that I found that actually were choosing that life is like finding Bigfoot. It just really doesn't exist, right? So whenever you see prostitution, what you should really be thinking in your head is there is somebody behind that person that is putting them under their control. It's force, fraud, or coercion, and forcing them, because all the traffickers want to do is make money. That's it. And prostitution is probably the number one thing that we see, but they'll make the victims do other stuff too. They'll make them sell drugs. They'll make them, buy stuff with stolen credit cards. They'll make them go out and write hot checks with stolen checks, anything that they can do to make money for the trafficker. And if you don't show up with your money for the trafficker, the trafficker is going to give them a quota for the day. Then they get physically assaulted, they get beaten, they have all these horrible things that happen to them. So they're kind of forced.
It's crazy. How, as an individual in a community that's listening to this podcast right now, what can they do to help with this problem?
I think probably the biggest thing that the community can do is to get educated on what human trafficking looks like, so that Well, I mean, just from listening to this podcast, that if you see prostitution, there's like a 93% chance that person is being trafficked. If you see a quote unquote someone that's involved in commercial sex. The idea that they're doing that like it's Pretty Woman is not realistic, right? So if you see that, if you see someone that is under somebody else's control, or they're not able to maybe have their own ID or their own passport or hold their own money, or that someone else is making all their decisions for them, those are pretty telltale signs that there's something not right going on here.
Mm-hmm. And when we notice it, call law enforcement.
Yes, exactly. You want to just call 911 and report it and say, hey, I don't know for sure, but this is what I saw and I'm worried about this. Law enforcement would way rather you call them and be wrong 9 times, and then that 10th time they find somebody. They don't care. They would rather you call, be wrong 9 times in a row, and then that 10th time they help somebody.
Yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind. Okay, so that's the human trafficking piece, which you've built this fantastic business. It's feel good, it's do good, it's growing good, it's all those things. I think the unique thing looking at it from a business perspective is you got very niche. You're like, hey, this is a background that I grew up in. I was a police officer. I got trained in this area. There's a need. I'm going to dive into that. How do you feel like that called you, or did you seek it out a little bit? Because everybody's trying to develop their niche market right now and where they can start getting ground and build from. Do you have any advice to somebody that's doing that?
I think the number one advice that I would have for anybody that wants to be an entrepreneur or own a business or anything like that, and that is, I know it sounds cliche, but you just have to be fearless. Mm-hmm. So for example, when I was in law enforcement trying to learn this stuff, I didn't have any mentors. I didn't have any training. I literally figured this out through like 10 to 12 years of just failing. Failure after failure after failure after failure after failure after failure. And eventually I would just figure a few things here and a few things here. And eventually I started coming up with some ideas, right? And these are the ideas that I'm teaching all across the world now, right? And I would bring those ideas to like, my command staff or people that were above me. And man, they wanted nothing to do with that. They're like, that's stupid. We've never done that before. There's nothing we've ever done. And I'm like, I think we should have a new way of looking at this. And nobody was supportive of it. Nobody was.
And how did you have the mindset to keep going?
I think it just came from the way I was raised.
Okay.
I grew up poor. And we didn't really have much. I mean, I had good family, but we didn't really have much monetarily wise. And I was raised by my dad that you just never give in. And then the other thing I think that was a big thing, and you totally can relate to this, is climbing mountains. Mm-hmm. How many times on those mountains are you sick or don't feel well, or you've been out there for weeks at a time, and I used to call it the quitting conversation. How often does the quitting conversation creep into our head, right? And you have to force that to get out of there. As a guide, I used to tell people, today is going to be the hardest day. And probably within 3 or 4 hours, you're going to want to go back to the tent, get in bed, have the Sherpas make you some tea, and you're not going to want to do this. You're going to have that quitting conversation, and you're going to have that conversation with yourself. All the reasons why it's okay if you leave. My friends won't care. They'll still think I did a good job. My family will still be supportive of me. It's kind of really opposite of what you really are thinking, which is keep going. Right?
Right.
And so I used to have to tell clients, when the quitting conversation starts to creep in, you got to put that out of your head, think of something fun. I'm on the beach in Thailand or whatever it is, right? And keep rolling and get rid of that. And I think it was the same way in other aspects of my life. I just never wanted to give in. And so you have to become fearless to some degree and then just keep going. And so I really think it was honestly that simple. I had a life coach one time. I probably can't say this on a podcast, but she basically said, you have to develop this I don't give a fuck attitude. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I've seen other people I've seen Elon Musk talk about that. I've seen other people talk about that. People that have really done great things kind of have that attitude, right?
Yeah. No, I think you have to have that attitude of, I see this thing, you don't. Mm-hmm. That's okay. I'm going to still do my thing because it makes sense to me. And the quitting conversation is going to show up because I'm human.
Every time.
Every time on a regular basis. And because you know it's going to show up, the game kind of becomes win. And then when it shows up, now the game is, how do I like whack-a-mole you back away and say, you're not winning, I'm winning. And it's important. I love that you say the quitting conversation, because it just gives you a label. And when we have a label, it gives us control to be able to pick a different choice.
And if you warn people that it's coming,
yeah,
then they're prepared for it, right? And it creeps into every aspect of our life, whether it's our personal relationships or our work or whatever we're doing, right? And I just think you have to get on top of that. And I think mountains was a big thing for me, because you have that all the time there, as you well know, right? And then growing up as I did, that was kind of jammed into my head that no matter what we do, you just don't quit. You just don't give in. Surviving the 6,000 people that applied for 60 spots, and going through the academy and everything, you just don't quit. You just don't give in. So I've kind of just tried to take that. And it doesn't mean that I'm not scared. I mean, in law enforcement, you're scared, but you're scared almost after the fact. Right.
You don't have space to be scared in the moment.
Yeah, and you're trained to run towards something when everyone else is running away, right? It doesn't mean you're not scared. You're scared after the fact when you go, oh, that was crazy. I'm glad I survived. But you just keep going. And I think I've tried to do that in all aspects of my life. And it doesn't always work out, but most of the time I think it does.
When hasn't it worked out for you?
Well, when I first started this business, I remember the very first day after retirement, I literally started calling around trying to basically sell what I was selling. And the very first day, I got told no 17 straight times. And then the next day, I got told no like 12 times. And then the next day, I got told no like 8 times. And I was getting kind of pissy.
Yeah.
And I literally had to take a break, and I went for a walk with my dogs and was trying to get my head into a good headspace, a good positive mind space, which is not always easy. I'm having the quitting conversation with myself. And then I literally went back and started trying again, and I sold the first training. And it just like opened up this door. And after that, it was like a waterfall. But literally those first 3 days, man, I was like over 40.
I grew up cold calling. Okay. So when I first got into finance, I had no idea that I really signed up for a cold calling job. I just thought people came in the door and they wanted to have financial advice. I didn't ever equate the fact that if I have a client, that meant I was calling that client on a phone. And so I had weeks of being hung up on the phone day after day after day. I'd go home every day crying, blah, 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 blah. I stuck with the job because my parents made me and I didn't have another option. But that rejection factor is something that is really hard to get used to, but I think a part of every path to success.
I 100% agree. And we've all, I don't even necessarily like the term failed, but we've all been taken off course a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's in the mountains, we've all had mountains that we didn't be able to climb because of the weather or Mother Nature or because of an injury or who knows what, right? Or we've had relationships that didn't fail. I mean, over 50% of Americans have been through a divorce. That happens. We've all had stuff that derails us from times, right? But we got to get back on track, be fearless, not let those things scare us or make us have a harder heart. It really should try to harden your determination, not your heart.
I like that. When you're building your business right now, there's people that have a 1 year, a 3 year, a 5 year, a 10-year plan. Do you have that mapped out that far in advance for you? Or what works for you on like making sure you're heading down the right path and in the direction you want to go and growing the way you want to grow?
I definitely have like 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, things like that out there.
Okay.
I think that's important. I'm a big believer in that you need to have, small things that you can achieve and roll with. But I'm also a believer in that you should have some really big goals. And I think most people don't set their goals big enough, honestly. I think they underestimate their own worth and their own talents and their own ability. So I think you need to set a goal that scares the shit out of you.
Yep.
And if it doesn't scare you, and you don't have like a weird pit in your stomach, that goal's not big enough. You got to go set something way bigger than that. Whatever it is, whether it's I want to make $10 million or I want to find a wife or a husband or have family or whatever it is. Put some crazy goal out there that you think is going to give you a pit in your stomach, because if it doesn't, it's not big enough.
And do you think you need that pit in your stomach to have the motivation to do it?
I think there's something about it that if you don't give into the quitting conversation, forces you to go down that path, right? So when I started my business, I went back and forth right off the bat about what should I be a nonprofit? Because almost everybody in the human trafficking world is a nonprofit. Do I want to be a nonprofit? Do I want to be not want to be a nonprofit? And I don't want to be a nonprofit. And there's a couple of reasons why, but probably the biggest reason why is I think of nonprofits very similarly as I do the government. Because I worked for the government for 27 years. I know what the government's like, right? And it is really easy to spend other people's money. Mm-hmm. And it is really easy to be fat and happy on other people's money. But when it's your money and when it's your business, you can't be fat and happy. You got to be lean and mean because otherwise you won't succeed. In the private business world, if you are not, it's got to be on a different plane or you go bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it should be. That's the way capitalism is. And I like that, right? So it forces me to be sharp. It forces me to be on my game all the time. It forces me to continually improve my product and continually stay on top of stuff. Because if I'm not the sharpest and if I'm not on top of my game, I will fail and I will go broke. But in the government, I worked there. I saw it. Oh, this guy's not done anything for 10 years. We're not going to fire him. Because they always got tax dollars coming in. It's not going to affect anything. But in the business world, if you have someone that's not doing work, they lose their job and you put someone else in there that will. It's completely different. So that's why I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to have a business because I wanted to be forced to be lean and mean and be my best all the time.
Mm-hmm. And now that you have this formula that you've created that has amazing results, how are you refining it with new information coming in?
So in the human trafficking world specifically, I like to think of us as being in the Renaissance. Okay. In other words, we're kind of still learning. So it's kind of like where we were 30 or 40 years ago with domestic violence, right? When I first went into law enforcement and was a 22-year-old kid, there was still those old crusty cops that were out there that would go to domestic violence calls and the wife would have a big black eye and you could tell their husband had punched her in the face or whatever. And I remember, I was there when that happened. And I remember this guy, he was about ready to retire anyway. And I remember he looked right at her and he said, "So what'd you do to piss him off?" And that was the attitude 30 or 40 years ago, right? Well, we changed that mindset. We changed that paradigm. We learned about, battered spouse syndrome, and we learned about all this other stuff that went along with it. And now we treat domestic violence completely differently. Well, I think that's kind of where we are with trafficking. We're changing that mindset. Oh, they're just prostitutes. They're just junkies. They're just drug addicts that have made a bunch of bad choices. And now we realize, oh, that's not really true. Right? These are just people that had some kind of vulnerability. They got exploited, and now they're in this really bad situation. And now they have PTSD, and they're trauma bonded, which we used to call Stockholm Syndrome. And now we understand the psychology behind it. So we're learning more and more every day. And what we do now in trafficking is not what we did 3 years ago or 5 years ago. And I think 3 years from now and 5 years from now, we're even going to be changing and evolving more. So that's why it's so important that we stay sharp and we stay on top of it. Because we're changing and we're rolling through this Renaissance phase. And I hope that, my goal is 20 years from now, I look back and go, man, how we do this is so much different than how we started. And I had a part to play in that. And because of that, we have hundreds of thousands of trafficking victims that are not being trafficked. And we put these horrible trafficker people in prison.
Do you feel like the U.S. is a step ahead of other countries in this right now? Yeah.
Sure. We're not perfect. We have issues. Mm-hmm. Every country does. Mm-hmm. But having traveled all around the world, and we have regardless of what anybody says, we have the best law enforcement in the world in America. And we should be very lucky that we have it. Mm-hmm.
No, my foreign travels, I was like, oh my goodness, if we just took a lot of people to see what goes on outside of here, we'd be like, oh, thank you.
We are very, very lucky.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of these countries, man, they don't have rights.
Right.
We have the right of not being able to incriminate ourselves. We have the right to, do a whole bunch of things, right? We have free speech. We have, all these other things that most places don't have. And our law enforcement is, even though we're not trained very well in trafficking, but we are trained, we're the best trained law enforcement in the world. And we are the best law enforcement in the world. And it doesn't take long traveling to other continents to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if people want to hire you and have you come into their police force or their community or their company, right? Like Delta Airlines in these different places hire you to come in and teach.
Yeah, so there's airlines, there's hotels, there's all kinds of companies that have a part to play in the human trafficking world, right? Because casinos, because girls are getting trafficked in all these different places, right? And so they can reach out to us at the Human Trafficking Training Center. That's our website, www.humantraffickingtrainingcenter.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always on there. That's how we found each other.
Yeah.
So LinkedIn's a good place. So those are a couple of easy places to find me.
All right. Well, thank you for all your work.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Yes.